Are you scared? Marcus asked with a grin, flashing his uneven teeth. Stephanie glared at him. No? Then why are you biting your nails? Teresa piped up from the back seat. Marcus, Teresa, and Steve laughed. They were right. Stephanie did feel a bit scared, and she had wanted to back out ever since her and Teresa's cousin Marcus had suggested the idea. At 21, she was the oldest of the four, and she had always been the most uptight and the least brave. Steve, Marcus's younger brother, had purchased the tickets to the Dr. Pepper Museum's paranormal tour, and now they were here. Marcus parked their black van on the street opposite the museum. Looks like we're the first ones here, said Steve. I told you it doesn't start until 7, Teresa mumbled. I don't know why we had to leave home so early. Because otherwise Steph would have bailed on us, Marcus laughed. Stephanie knew they would tease her about trying to talk them out of going and how scared she was all through Halloween, Thanksgiving, and probably even Christmas. The unknown had always scared her. It wasn't that she really believed in ghosts, she told herself, but she wasn't a non-believer either. She just thought that things, whatever they were, should be left alone and not disturbed just for the entertainment of some teenage kids. After all, you never knew what might happen. Why don't we play a game when we wait for the museum to open? Teresa suggested. How about truth or dare? Marcus smiled. I think we can come up with some ghostly dares. Oh my God, you will never grow up. I'm going for a walk around the block. Stephanie slammed the car door behind her. There was a light breeze, and the evening felt cool for being Texas in October. She put up her hood and walked across the street, the museum windows sending a warm light her way. This 100-year-old building didn't look scary at all. It was just an old bottle factory, and actually quite pretty with its yellow bricks and red roof. A gust picked up a plastic bag from the sidewalk and let it twirl in the wind and settle in a tree. Swaying from side to side, Stephanie looked as if mesmerized. She could sense they were coming up behind her, yet she screamed when Teresa's skinny fingers grabbed her waist. Gotcha! Looking at the ghost in the tree? Steve asked. There's no ghost in the tree, Stephanie countered. It's just a plastic bag. Are you sure? Marcus chimed in. I think it looks like a ghostly face saying, Ooh, Steph, don't leave me here. Even though she knew it was just a joke, Marcus was right. The plastic bag did resemble a ghostly, howling face. Stephanie closed her eyes briefly and took a deep breath before joining the others at the entrance. These are your EMF readers. EMF stands for electric magnetic field, and the fields are stronger in haunted areas. The tour guide's voice echoed slightly in the museum lobby. If your readers start going off, it's a sign a ghost is near. The guide brought the group upstairs to what she said was the museum's most haunted rooms. She brought out something called a spirit box and explained that the spirits find ways to talk through the box using different frequencies. Marcus, Steve, and Teresa sat down close to the box, eager to hear their first ghost through the static noise. Stephanie paced a bit behind them, not sure if she should sit down or run to the bathroom. She was curious. It was just that suddenly her EMF reader went off. Hello? Is there anyone here? The tour guide asked. Everyone gathered around the spirit box and went quiet, but all that could be heard was a continuing static noise. It seems they don't want to talk to us today. Let's go into the other room and see if anyone would like to speak with us there. How about the basement? Marcus interrupted. We usually don't go to the basement, the guide replied. The spirits there don't like to be disturbed. As soon as the guide had spoken, Marcus and Steve looked at each other, and Stephanie knew what they were up to. As the rest of the group trailed along behind the guide, Marcus and Steve held Teresa and Stephanie back. I know what you're thinking, but the guide said they don't want to be disturbed, Stephanie pleaded. Well, that's a point, Marcus exclaimed. If they don't want to be disturbed, we'll definitely get a show. Maybe they will throw things at us, Teresa chimed in. I thought none of you believed in these kind of things, Stephanie said. Tonight might be the night we do, Steve whispered, and started sneaking out of the room, careful not to be seen by the tour guide. It was clear that the basement was off limits for visitors, with books and jars stacked in piles along the walls, and the air dusty and thick. Slowly, they walked across the basement, the only light being from Marcus's cell phone. What are we looking for? Asked Teresa. I don't really know, to be honest. Steve laughed. Suddenly, they could hear a crash behind them, and they all stopped. Probably just a rat, Marcus said. Wasn't it this street that was called Rat Row back in the days? Or was I closer to the bridge? There was another crash. This time closer to where the group was standing. Marcus's phone flickered, eventually going dark. One by one, the EMF readers buzzed. Can you feel that? Steve whispered. And they all could. An oppressive darkness had descended upon them, and they knew they were no longer alone. Teresa grabbed Stephanie's hand. Stephanie wanted to say something comforting, wanted to run, but she was frozen to the spot, sweat trickling down her spine. It got hotter and hotter. Fire! Stephanie yelled. She tried to run to where she thought the exit was, but flames were everywhere, licking the walls, climbing up the staircase. Teresa? Steve? Marcus, where are you? A light caught her eye, a small window across from her. Making her way through the flames, she once again tried to call her friends, but there was no one there. When had she let go of Teresa's hand? Had they already made it out? When she reached the other side of the room, she realized there was no window. Instead, she was looking into a mirror, reflecting the flames behind her, because it was her reflection, wasn't it? Stephanie covered her mouth with her sleeve in an attempt to breathe in less smoke, and she could see the reflection doing the same movement. But instead of Stephanie's casual jeans and hoodie, the reflection was wearing an old dress reaching all the way to her feet, her hair pinned in braids on top of her head. The reflection stared back at Stephanie, reaching out her pale, skinny hand. Stephanie, don't leave me here. A bright light flickered, and Stephanie heard voices. Eventually, the brain fog cleared, and she realized she was laying on the floor in the museum lobby, her legs elevated on Steve's knees to increase blood flow to her brain. Stephanie, talk to us. Teresa's worried face came into view. We're sorry for scaring you like that, Marcus said, his neck and cheeks flushed. We didn't know you would faint. Slowly, she sat up, her arms and legs weak. The tour guide handed her a juice and took Marcus aside, possibly scolding him for going down to the basement. There was no fire? Stephanie's dry lips cracked when she tried to speak. Teresa and Steve looked at each other and hushed Stephanie when she asked what had happened in the basement. The guide made her way back. You're feeling okay? Steve lifted Stephanie up in his arms. We'll be fine. Thanks so much for helping us. Back in the car, all was quiet. Marcus sternly fixed on the road ahead of them, Steve in the front seat with his eyes closed, and Teresa nervously glancing at Stephanie, holding her hand. So, is anyone going to tell me what happened? Stephanie finally said, and broke the heavy silence. Steve shifted in his seat. When Marcus' phone died, you passed out. That's it? Stephanie was getting frustrated. There was clearly something they were not telling her. Teresa brought Stephanie's hand to her cheek. I don't think we really know what happened. Her voice was close to tears. Stephanie shivered. Did you see it too? Stephanie looked into her sister's eyes, her pupils wide in the darkness. Teresa cleared her throat, her voice barely a whisper. We saw it. Through you.
From the Ghost Next Door podcast. Should we take that again?
Yes.
This is Sally Chachich and Sara Mattsson from the Ghost Next Door. We would like to welcome Dr. Cindy Little, a doctor in philosophy and a parapsychologist based in Waco, Texas. First of all, thank you for joining us, Dr. Little.
Well, thank you for having me.
We would love to know a little bit about your work as a parapsychologist.
Well, I started about 16, 17 years ago, really getting interested in ghost hunting. The whole idea of going out into these old haunted, spooky buildings and looking for ghosts and trying to document paranormal activity. And I thought that that was, a lot of fun. And I still do a lot of ghost hunting. I love that. But as I finished up my doctoral studies, I learned how to do academic research. And so that is what really got me interested in the field of parapsychology, which is a discipline that encompasses all of that ghostly activity, haunted places and paranormal activity. And so I took some courses from the Rhine Research Center here in the US. It's one of the oldest parapsychology centers here in the US. And of course, then I got my PhD as well in educational psychology and connected up eventually with some other parapsychologists, Dr. James Horan and Dr. Brian Lath. And we have been doing independent parapsychology studies that are being published in academic journals. So that's really kind of, like I said, there's two sides of it. There's kind of the fun, practical ghost hunting side and the academic research side. And I love them both for different reasons. They're just, it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, and you mentioned you are doing a lot of research, and you have several published research papers, including one that we read, Uncharted Features and Dynamics of the South Shields Poltergeist, published in 2022.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about that research?
Well, I was not there for the poltergeist study. I was actually in the home observing what was going on, which is really too bad because it was a crazy, crazy case. The main researcher that, had boots on the ground for that study was Darren Ritson, and he wrote the book, The South Shields Poltergeist. And in fact, he's written several books on this particular case, and they're all great. And so we connected up with him and were able to write that paper through the documents and the evidence that he gave to us, the other researchers here in the US. And it was just wild. It was really kind of a behind the scenes look for us of what was presented in the book. We got the mother's journal. We got to see firsthand photographs of the father of the family, who had these like huge bloody scratches across his chest. There was just something that was really tormenting him in the house. Actual video of a water bottle, like a little drinking plastic water bottle that had water in it. It was tipped up on its edge, on its side, and it was just violently shaking. The activity that went on in that house was just absolutely bonkers. There was butter that would melt through the ceiling, which was weird, but not really dangerous. But sometimes the mom would go into the kitchen and butcher knives would come out of the block and be thrown at her. They had a little boy, and he had this toy called a doodle board, and it was just like a little writing board. And the poltergeist eventually started communicating with the researchers in the house by writing back and forth messages on the doodle board, which was really interesting. And some of them were like, "Hi," or "I'm Sam," but some of them were like, "I hate you. I'm gonna kill you." It was pretty crazy. But we here in the US, working with Darren Ritson, who was there in the house a few years earlier before we met him, had the opportunity to sift through all of that evidence and write up the paper.
Wow. That's fascinating. The doodle board is very creepy, and the scratch marks. Yeah, that poor family.
Yeah, it was very traumatic. And so yeah, if you are really into poltergeist cases, I highly recommend the book The South Shields Poltergeist by Darren Ritson. You can get it on Amazon, and it's a great read because it is a really, really crazy case.
And this was a case that happened in England in the early 2000s.
Yes, yes.
So it's not an old legend or anything like that. It's actually, pretty in modern times.
Yes, it's a more recent case. And yeah, it isn't this, well, these people investigated this several years ago and, nobody could contact them. It isn't one of those things. I mean, we were collaborating with the researcher, the English researcher that was there and documented all of this. So that was his firsthand account.
And what was your conclusion with the research?
Well, in the paper, what we talked about was the handwriting analysis of the doodle board. And there were several handwriting analyzations done, and graphic experts that were looking at the handwriting, and they came to the conclusion that it was most similar to the dad's writing in the house. Now, we know that the father of the family was not faking it. I mean, he wasn't like grabbing the doodle board and, writing and, hiding it somehow, because what they did, the researchers would take the doodle board, erase it. This was all in the little boy's room. They would erase the doodle board, put it in a closet, shut the door, and then a few minutes later, pull the doodle board out and would see the communication from the poltergeist. So it wasn't the father writing on the board. But the conclusion that we came to was that the poltergeist activity could have been drawn in or triggered by the father of the family, because at that time he was under a great deal of stress. And there are theories out there in parapsychology that individuals who are under a great deal of stress can actually trigger poltergeist activity. So that was one of the main conclusions that we came to on the case.
Wow, that's so interesting. I bet he was under a great deal of stress. It sounds.
Yeah, I have no doubt.
And as you mentioned, there are several paranormal theories out there. Can you share a bit more about these kind of main theories?
Oh, yes, absolutely. One of the theories that the two researchers I'm working with are really gathering more and more support for is it's called haunted person or haunted people syndrome. And the book Ghosted by Dr. Brian Laith, Dr. James Horan, and there's some other authors as well. And theory that's put forth in that book, I think, has a lot of merit. And what it is that we're finding that people that are high in a couple of mental traits, one of them being something called transliminality. And what that is we have mental barriers between the unconscious mind, the subconscious mind, and the environment, and that sensory information that comes in to our brain. Well, people that are high in this trait called transliminality, those barriers, it's almost like the fence has got a little hole in it, or the gate's just slightly open. And so information passes more easily between subconscious, unconscious, and the environmental information that's coming in. So that's one thing. Another thing is that we find if somebody's high in that trait and they believe that ghosts are real, they're not skeptics, they believe in the paranormal, and you combine that even a little more, there are people that have more psychic type abilities like ESP, etc. And you've got this person, and I like to call them ghost magnets, because you put them in what we call a liminal environment, or kind of an unsettling environment, which, hey, if you've been in a lot of spooky places, it's kind of like, oh, this is kind of creepy and unsettling, and there's a history of paranormal activity. You put these people in these types of places, and paranormal activity happens, not just for them, but for the people around them. So it's kind of the right person in the right place equals ghosts. And that's what we're finding. We're finding it's some kind of interaction between certain people and how their brains are wired up in the environment. And we just don't exactly, we haven't figured that out yet, but we just know there seems to be a relationship there.
Do
Wow.
these so-called ghost magnets, have you found that they have any certain characteristics?
Well, like I said, other than, if we test them for things like transliminality, what I find is the ones that I know personally, and I know a few, and they're great to take on investigations because stuff always happens. Yeah. And I find that they lean a little more towards having these psychic type abilities as well. And for some reason, they're very sensitive to the environment and paranormal activity that's going on, or it's kind of like they see and experience the environment a little differently than everybody else.
I have a question about this. There's a lot of talk out there, and especially this sort of new age community, that you can develop psychic abilities. What's your personal thoughts on that? Do you think you can develop these abilities, or do you think that you more awaken them and are predispositioned to them, or have no thought around that at all?
Oh, yeah. And there again, that's a big part of the field of parapsychology, or those what we call psi abilities, like telepathy, telekinesis, ESP, all of those kind of like superhero abilities. Um, I believe that everybody has these types of abilities, but it's on a spectrum. So I look at myself, and I'm way at one end of the spectrum. Say, one, you have very little to no abilities, to 10, you're like Dr. X on the X-Men. Um, and I think people are on that spectrum. I do think these are natural abilities. I don't think there's anything hooky dooky or new agey, there's like over 150 years of academic scientific laboratory studies that show these abilities are real. So, yes, I believe they can be developed, but to a point. I look at them like any other ability. I think depending on, whether or not you've got a lot of natural talent in that or not.
That's so interesting. Thanks for sharing your thoughts around that. Um, our haunting story today is inspired by the ghosts at the Dr. Pepper Museum. We know that you've been there as an investigator on a few occasions. Can you tell us about some of your experiences at the museum?
Oh, absolutely. It is one of my absolute favorite places, haunted places here in Waco. And I teach a class on paranormal investigating at one of our local community colleges. I've been doing that since 2016, and I take my students there for field trips, and we do a ghost hunt. And aside from that, I have been a paranormal tour guide there at the Dr. Pepper Museum for a few years. So, yes, I'm very familiar with the ghosts at the Dr. Pepper Museum. And they've got a little bit of everything. It was originally the Artesian Manufacturing and Bottling Company, and they bottled up Dr. Pepper there starting in 1906, and eventually the company moved to Dallas, which is north of us, and did their bottling there. But later on in the 90s, they opened it up as the Dr. Pepper Museum. So Some of the ghosts, we have seen full body apparitions of a lady in black, kind of in black Victorian mourning dress in the basement. There's been poltergeist activity in the basement where people's coffee mugs and staplers and things will levitate and like shoot off of the desk. Um, we've seen shadow people. We've had strange knocks on doors. Some of my camera equipment has been fiddled with. People have been touched. We have this, what we call, kind of a grabby ghost on the second floor, and he's grabbed ladies' thighs and ankles. And yeah, and one time it poked me in the behind. And so just all we've heard. Yeah. I'm just thinking of all the things that happened there. Children laughing, children running, strange light activity, some like camera flashes going off in some of the display cases. Yeah, just you name it, it has happened at the Dr. Pepper Museum.
Wow, it sounds like a very active location.
Yes.
It is. It is.
We heard that there are several theories on who might be haunting Dr. Pepper Museum. Do you have your own theory or ideas who these ghosts might be?
Well, yeah, I do. And I don't want to give away too much in case somebody wants to come to the Dr. Pepper Museum. But in 1953, there was an F5 tornado that came through Waco. And one of the workers at that time at the Dr. Pepper Museum, a wall fell on him and crushed him during the tornado. And his nickname was Shorty. And we've done communication sessions with Shorty before, so we think that Shorty is one of the ghosts there. Before the bottling building was there was a boarding house where there was a fire and several children lost their lives. So we're not surprised that we're hearing children laughing and running, so perhaps some of the ghosts of the children that died in the fire might still be sticking around. And we think that there's kind of a grumpy ghost that hangs out in the basement. And I've had students down there that speak Spanish, and we've done communication sessions in English, and we really haven't gotten much. But when one of my students would do communication sessions in Spanish, he would get responses through the spirit box from a guy named Juan, and he just didn't want to be bothered. It's like, well, what are you doing, Juan? And I'm working. Go away. So, so we might have, this kind of grumpy ghost that's, still sticking around, just trying to do his job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we read about that the basement ghost doesn't really like to be disturbed.
No, not really. When we take people on tours, we just don't do any kind of communication sessions or anything. But when I take my students there, we'll do communication sessions, and sometimes the lights will flicker or we'll get kind of strange perfume smells. We think the ghost hangs out in this kind of hole it's kind of hard to describe, but there's like this crawl space under the building. And since we're in the basement, there's like an access hole to underneath the museum itself, and there's like some wire over it. And you think the ghost kind of hangs out in there because whenever we've had people get near that, they've gotten like an overwhelming sense of dread and fear. And there have been other paranormal investigators that have gotten like grabbed through the wiring, have heard like kind of strange skittering noises, and haven't seen anything like rodents or anything like that. But it's really, really kind of a spooky area of the basement.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Little, for joining us on the show. It was wonderful to chat to you and hear all these incredible stories. Thank you for listening to The Ghost Next Door. This was episode 3 of season 2, The Ghost at the Dr. Pepper Museum, performed by Sara Mattsson. This story is a creative reimagining inspired by the ghostly history of the Dr. Pepper Museum in Waco, Texas, USA. This episode features an interview with Dr. Cindy Little, a doctor in philosophy and parapsychologist based in Waco. You can find us on YouTube and all of your favorite podcast platforms. Please support us by subscribing and following us on social media at The Ghost Next Door Podcast. Our next ghostly episode will be released in January 2025.